Hello, historians, and welcome to On This Day in History. On this day, your daily insight into what has happened in the past and how that has influenced the events of the present. On this day, because yesterday makes today and changes what happens tomorrow. So, a short look at what happened on this day today. So, on this day in history, the 18th of May. In 1756, Great Britain declares war on France. This is part of the 7 Years' War. Now, get ready to notice a quick trend on events on this day in history to begin, because in 1803, guess what? Britain declares war on France after Napoleon Bonaparte continues interfering in Italy and Switzerland. This is all part of the Napoleonic Wars. On this day in 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte proclaimed Emperor of France by the French Senate. The irony of this, of course, being France had just had a revolution where they decided they didn't want a king who could be in charge of everything and tell them all what to do. And that was begun in 1789, and it sort of came to an end with Napoleon being crowned emperor for life. Good work, guys. In 1896, the US Supreme Court has a very famous case known as Plessy versus Ferguson, which legitimizes racial separation. In 1897, Dracula by Bram Stoker is published in London. Quick, what I consider to be funny story about this. Only recently did they discover that this particular story of Dracula, when it was translated into Icelandic, the translator who was translating the story decided this story is not particularly exciting or interesting enough for me, and so edited the story of Dracula in the translation and wrote essentially a new story. So they didn't just translate Dracula, they took the ideas of Dracula and wrote their own story in Icelandic. But because so few people speak Icelandic, no one actually noticed that the translator had done this for about 80 years, or it was 80 or 90 years. And it was only just recently discovered that this had been done. So this was like the original fan fiction. So everyone in Iceland, for example, was reading this in their native Icelandic language. Oh my God, this is the best story ever. And then they read it in English, they go, wait a minute, this is Dracula. And that's how they noticed. Quite amusing. In 1933, for anyone who is studying the Great Depression era, the Tennessee Valley Act was signed on this day by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. If you don't know what that is, it's kind of a big deal. So go and Google that one. And on this day in 1980, Mount St. Helens erupts, causing the largest landslide in history. Now, fortunately, they sort of saw it coming because it had been stirring for a long time. So the death toll was relatively low, 57 people. It's always a tragedy when anyone dies, but that could have been much, much worse. But it cost $1 billion of damage. Quite a large eruption. Now, in terms of the deep dive for today, we are actually going to look at this Plessy versus Ferguson case. This is what happened. Now, it was a landmark case in the US Supreme Court, and it created this idea, if you've ever heard the phrase, separate but equal. So a little bit of background. Obviously, this will not do the entire thing justice, obviously, but a little bit of background. You may be aware that the United States had slavery. I hope you were. And you may be aware that that was, generally speaking, only in the South by the mid-1800s. And then they had a civil war with the idea that the southern slaveholding states thought that the new president, Abraham Lincoln, was going to tell them they couldn't have slaves anymore, which would be restriction on their freedoms. How dare you tell us what to do and control how we behave? That's awful. That would be like slavery. Oh, wait. Anyway, so they had this civil war over slavery, and the North, who wanted no slavery, ends up winning. And as a result of that, in 1868, they passed this a series of amendments, but this one in particular, the 14th Amendment, which gave citizenship to all persons born in or naturalized in the United States, which includes former slaves. So all former slaves, which are, of course, of African descent, guaranteed them equal protection under the laws. That's kind of a big deal, okay? So what was at the heart of this case was in Louisiana, one of the Southern American states in 1890, They passed a law providing for separate railway carriages for the white and colored races. Now, it did say that all passenger railways, even though they would be separate, they should be equal in facilities. So this was a way of saying white people and black people cannot mix on public transport. So what ends up happening? Well, it's called Plessy versus Ferguson because this gentleman, Homer Plessy, was the one who brought it to court to challenge this railroad law, forcing him to sit in a separate carriage, saying it was a violation of his rights under the 14th Amendment. Remember the 14th Amendment, equal protection of laws. So I should be allowed as much freedom as anyone else. Now, one of the particular justices, a guy by the name of John Marshall Harlan, was indeed agreeing with Plessy and said, yes, our constitution should be colorblind. We shouldn't be able to tell black people they can or cannot sit wherever they wish to sit. But all of the other justices on the Supreme Court did not agree. They ruled for the railroad. So they said the railroad company is allowed to have separate, requires separate seating for its black customers. So this is where we get this thing called Jim Crow laws. This is a nickname. They're not officially named after Jim Crow laws, but Jim Crow was a sort of unkind nickname for African Americans, for black Americans, where it sort of stereotyped them in many ways. And the series of laws that were passed after this, because once this law goes through, and this is why it's such a big deal, the Supreme Court, the highest court in the United States, has basically told all of the Southern United States, hey, it's cool if you want to create laws controlling what black people are and aren't allowed to do. We're going to say that is constitutional. That's fine. We don't mind. So it's kind of a big deal. Now, in terms of what this ends up changing, the Jim Crow laws, well, it wasn't just public transport in terms of buses and trains. Shops wouldn't serve black customers. They would have signs saying whites only, post offices, drinking fountains, libraries. Up until the 1940s, the American Red Cross even kept African American blood segregated from white blood. So you can imagine something horrible is happening. This patient needs a blood transfusion. Whoa, hang on. We can't be putting black blood in a white person. That's terrible. Which, of course, it isn't terrible. That would be saving someone's life. Letting someone die because of racism, that would be terrible. So this goes to show the long-term impact of this particular court case. Now, this is what John Marshall Harlan had to say in his dissent opinion, because every time the Supreme Court passes a ruling, any of the justices who disagree, they get to write their own little explanation of why they disagreed. And this is called the dissent opinion. This is the dissent opinion because it was one justice. Every other justice thought, no, it's fine. You can control black people. That's no problem. This is what John Marshall Harlan had to say. The arbitrary separation of citizens on the basis of race while they are on a public highway is a badge of servitude, wholly inconsistent with the civil freedom and the equality before the law established by the Constitution, he wrote. It cannot be justified upon any legal grounds. Now, what makes this particular ruling or particular idea, this dissent opinion, quite heavy or gives it a little bit more weight, gives it a little bit more authority, is the fact that it is completely and utterly based on an interpretation on the law. And we know that it's completely and utterly based on the law, not his own personal opinion, because this particular justice, back before the Civil War, had in fact been a slave-holding man. So he had slaves. He was not a progressive person. It's not like he was part of the anti-slavery movement or anything like that. He literally looked at the case and said, no, our Constitution says you cannot, it's illegal to discriminate based on race. This law discriminates based on race. It is illegal. He literally just looked at the law when he did that. Do not think that this opinion represents a fantastic man who was progressive in his ideas. But it just goes to show that even someone who held slaves could say that this was plainly illegal. So what ends up happening over the course of the decades is you get these series of Jim Crow laws. This is just some examples. It shall be unlawful for a Negro and a white person to play together or in company with each other in any games of cards, dice, dominoes, or checkers. That was passed in Birmingham, Alabama in 1930. Keep in mind, that Plessy versus Ferguson was 1896. They are still passing these Jim Crow laws in 1930. It shall be unlawful for any white prisoner to be handcuffed or otherwise chained or tied to a Negro prisoner. Arkansas, 1903. No colored barber shall serve as a barber to white women or girls. Atlanta, Georgia, 1926. So we can see this is all across the southern United States. The first law, Plessy versus Ferguson, was in Louisiana. We can see laws are being passed in Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, all over the southern United States. Separate but equal. Yeah, right. So just as an example, this is the state of Carolina, where, sorry, I should say South Carolina, where the state spent $179 per year educating white children. Now, keep in mind, this is back in the day, $179 is actually a lot of money at that time. So they spend $179 per year educating white children. And in the same state, they spent $43 per year educating black children. You can see the difference in schools. You can see the difference in class sizes. You can imagine the difference in outcomes. Now, this is an example of separate but equal being written on a piece of paper, but doesn't actually take place in reality. This is not equal. This is inherently not equal. Now, this is where we use on this day. What happened yesterday shapes today, which changes tomorrow. You can imagine you pass a law in 1896 saying black people and white people have to be separate. Then you get for decades and decades and decades, white schools being better funded, better resourced, getting better outcomes than black schools. You're going to have generations of people that are not getting the education they deserve and are entitled to. But then at the same time, those white people, the white folks in those southern states turn around and say, oh, but look at these black people, they can't read, they can't do it. Well, you've put them in, you've not delivered an equal education. It's not the race that has anything to do with it. It is what they're going to school in. You can imagine if you don't send a white kid to school and you do send a black kid to school, the black kid is going to do better than the white kid. It will not have anything to do with their race. It is simply a matter of facilities and fairness and justice, okay? We must make this clear. There is absolutely no racial difference in educational outcomes. That's not a thing. Don't ever think that it is, okay? If you educate some people and don't educate others, that is what changes outcome. That is what it's all about. So, in terms of the legacy of the case, and this is why we focus on education, that was in 1896. Now, it would not be until 1954, so 58 years later, that another case would reach the Supreme Court, and this is at the very beginnings of what's known as the Civil Rights Movement, that the majority of the Supreme Court, again, 58 years later, would agree with John Marshall Harlan's opinion in Plessy versus Ferguson. So John Marshall Harlan, remember, was the one who said, excuse me, this is illegal under the 14th Amendment. And everyone was like, shut up, that doesn't matter. We can do what we want. 58 years later, in this case, the Supreme Court actually was like, hang on, this is crazy. This is totally and utterly illegal. So in writing the majority opinion, so the actual binding opinion on this case, Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote that the doctrine of separate but equal has no place in public education, calling segregated schools inherently unequal, and declaring that the plaintiffs in the Brown case were being deprived of the equal protection under the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. So in 1896, they said, oh no, you can totally mistreat people. That's fine. It doesn't matter about the 14th Amendment. By 1954, they're like, actually, that 14th Amendment kind of matters. Now, this is where we get a little bit into the weeds here, guys. A law is only as effective as the people that put it into practice. If I were to create a law saying you cannot possibly treat people unfairly, but the people who are in charge of enforcing that law disagree with it and therefore don't enforce it, the law is meaningless, okay? So the system only works if everyone is enforcing these laws and following these laws thoroughly. For example, you could say there are laws against theft, but people still commit theft. If no one ever prosecuted those people, if no one ever investigated those particular instances, they would just continue to get away with it, and it would happen again and again and again and again and again. This is the important thing we need to understand. Laws that can be passed, but they must also be enforced. Okay, so I hope you have enjoyed this particular deep dive. For anyone who is studying or has studied civil rights, Plessy versus Ferguson is a landmark and very, very important case. And I think it needs to be understood in the wider context, not just in the United States, because that one particular decision sort of leads to the United States having this racial segregation, separation, separate but equal ideas, and the United States being a cultural leader in the world exports that idea overseas. So what that means is we all look to the United States for our movies, our music, our TV shows, our news sometimes, all of those sorts of things. If the United States is doing those things incorrectly, it exports that culture around the world. And that is why it is important to understand everything is connected. Okay, so a court case in America sort of helps to influence ideas about racial prejudices or racial hierarchies in other countries as well. So it is very important that we know this. More on that on this day. So thank you very much. I hope you have learned something, and I will speak to you tomorrow.